Hey Tim, how's it going?
Hey Jonah,
How are you? Where are you at right now?
I'm in Chicago, my studio, where I've been for 14 months. Like everybody else is wherever you are. So I'm good. I'm good. Summertime here, so
Nice, nice. And so I see the Nowhere Generation flag in the back. I want to talk, sort of get into the album. I listened to your manifesto, which I found to be really interesting. And I was sort of curious, I guess maybe we're around the same age. I think it's very sort of easy to get sort of jaded about maybe this younger generation. And I was curious
mhm.
sort of what keeps you kind of so, you talk about sort of opinions about them being kind of reductive and maybe people joke about this generation a lot. I mean, what to you keeps you from kind of having that sort of cynicism about it?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like I do have a lot of hope and faith in like this future generation. And I think it's because I have a lot of proximity to them doing what I do, like I get the opportunity to I like to say that I have a front row seat to the front row seats, like I meet people who kind of inspire me. They're often younger people who are amazing people. And like I know that if this young person I just met ever gets their hand on the steering wheel, we're gonna be in a good place.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, how do you think maybe being a father has sort of affected kind of the way maybe you view that generation as well?
My kids are older now. I have two teenage daughters, and all I can tell you is that I know it's going to be different. Like they're going into like a lot of uncharted territory. I don't even know how much of my own experience, is even useful to them, you know? And so that's on my mind because, like, I mean, they're your kids and you want them to have good experiences and you want to set them up for success. And like the world today is such like a fluid and moving target, and there's, um, we've normalized the idea in America that you can work a full-time job and still be poor.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like one thing you talked about, and we don't have to get too deep into this, was sort of this idea that the sort of more equitable kind of system has been replaced by, benefiting the few. And I think it's really interesting because in some ways, I think it's always kind of been that way.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. Like I think there are some obvious negative things happening, concentrated wealth and the rise of the 1% and global warming and school shootings, the anxieties of social media, presenting a lifestyle you can't live up to. And then there are some like silver linings, like, automation seems like a terrible thing, but it's also going to get rid of some terrible jobs. People shouldn't be working, or like the world is different. Like there's gonna be shifts, and so those are all things that like to take like with like the good and the bad. But if people aren't like starting a family because they have economic concerns, if they're buying houses later in life, if they have way less savings, and if we just have downward mobility in general, then something's wrong. We need to like kind of we need to pop the hood and look at the engine.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I'd imagine for you and Rise Against, I mean, things must be so different as well. I mean, economics aside, just the way you're releasing music, the way you interact with your fans. I mean, is that sort of, I mean, obviously in your early days, there wasn't social media. I mean, is that something
Right.
you've had to kind of adjust to? Or is that something that feels kind of more normalized for you at this point in the band's career?
I finally got an email that was like our name and then the word TikTok next to it. Right. And I was like, oh, wait. And like I have teenage daughters. Like I'm intimately familiar with TikTok, but I never like thought about it in terms of like, who we are, what we do. And your first thought, as especially as someone who's 42 and grew up in punk and hardcore, is like, I want nothing to do with this medium. And then your second thought is like, you have to go where the conversation is. Like, this is where the conversation is happening. You go to where the conversation is happening. And so like, I use this as an example. I don't think you're going to see Rise Against doing dances to Ariana Grande songs, but like, we will always be somebody who will go to where the conversation is, where it's at. And that's constantly changing. And like you said, we've been a band for 20 years. We started this band, before there was social media, and people still bought physical records, I mean, so we started this band in a whole different landscape. And I think the only reason that we're still here, or one of the reasons that we're still here, is that we've managed to navigate those waters in a way that it's forward looking, but still like maintaining who we are. So everything we do still has our fingerprint on it.
I mean, you know, I guess it was 4 years between this album and Wolves, which is
Yeah.
a long time for Rise Against, not a long time for a lot of bands. And I was curious sort of what it was like putting this record kind of together. I mean, did COVID mess with the timing, or were you taking a break anyways, or sort of what was sort of the genesis of kind of writing and kind of recording these songs?
Yeah, actually, so we managed to wrap this thing up before COVID, and so it shouldn't have been a 4-year gap. It should have been more like a 3-year gap, which still would have been pretty long for us. And so it made it even longer. Much of what we did, and especially the meaningful parts of what we did, like, I think of what you can't do over like a Zoom call or remotely, like songwriting. You need like be in the room. Like I write music, Joe writes music, but like when I present it to those three guys, like it becomes Rise Against, and so you need that, and luckily we were able to have those important parts. So did all that songwriting, tracking, everything with Bill Stevenson at the blasting room of Fort Collins. And then COVID shut everything down. And the stuff that we did was more superficial after that, like mixing, mastering, artwork, the little bells and whistles, which was nice to be able to spend time on, because usually that stuff doesn't necessarily get the time allocated towards it, and so it was nice to be able to tweak everything till it was just right.
That's interesting. I mean, what was it like? Obviously, you've worked with Bill, since, I don't know, 2003 or something. I mean, what's it like kind of, do you still get starstruck around him or anything, sort of coming from, him being in Descendants, Black Flag, all these legendary bands, or is he just sort of like a friend at this point? I'm sure he's a friend, but what's that like for you?
Yeah, he's definitely like become a friend, and like, one of the closest friends I have like in this music world. Like I've been on vacation with his family, like we definitely hang out. And you're normally not starstruck at all, but every once in a while, like I'll be telling a story about something that we did like 5 years ago. And he'll be like, oh, that reminds me of me and Henry in DC in like 82. And I'm like, oh, right. Your stories beat my stories.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm bringing a knife to the gunfight,
Yeah.
And that's when you realize, holy shit, this guy is a pillar of punk rock. He is an institution. And to have a hand in, Black Flag and the Descendants, just I don't know. He's the real deal. Bill's just like incredible. He's a big part of who Rise Against is too, because we managed to meet him when we were young and impressionable. And like I think he helped us like navigate everything. He helped us like find our identity, and helped us like be a punk band that never wanted to be limited by some of the glass ceilings of punk, and so it's a fine line, right? And Bill understood it, and he became like a mentor, guru type person in my life and the band's life.
I mean, I think that's totally true, and I think that's such an interesting thing about Rise Against, because I think there are really not many bands that have come from the punk scene and had the kind of sort of sustained mainstream success you've had, while also sort of still being a part of that scene. I mean, how conscious is that for you? Like, is there a point where you're like, okay, this part sounds cool, but it's like too crazy for Rise Against, or is it let's make it work, or or is it just sort of the way it comes out when the four of you are in a room?
Yeah, it's not very conscious, I'll tell you that much. Like we just kind of we play like what sounds good, and then like you play to your strengths too. Like what the four of you do well, if you're able to make that distinction, you know what I mean, and play to your strengths, and I think that's important. I remember having a conversation with Tom Morello, and we were doing an acoustic tour together, and he was like, so he was kind of, it was either the acoustic tour, I think we were doing some protests together, and so it was like this misfit, like ragtag group of guitar players, like me and I think Wayne Kramer, and then I think Mike from the Street Dogs, and then Tom Morello. And I remember him saying like, I was never that good at sports, but I knew how to win with the team I was given.
That's interesting. You mentioned Wayne Kramer. I just finished reading his memoir like 2 days ago, The Hard
Oh,
Stuff.
really?
Have you read that?
I've not even read it. No, I need to.
It's insane. Yeah.
Really?
I mean, it's a really wild story. Yeah.
Dude, Brother Wayne is a character. And so I was like, it hit me where on that bus, like telling stories, whatever, it was like, whoa, this is a crazy chain. Cause like what Rage was for me, MC5 was for him, and it was
Totally.
just crazy to be like one of those moments with snapshots in time where, it's like, this is the family of punk rock right here.
Yeah. And then what's even probably crazier for you is that, Rise is probably that band for a lot of current bands, or like a lot of gateways into that punk scene. I mean, what does that sort of feel like?
I mean, yeah, that's what you hope. You hope that you're just the next link in the chain, and that's that has guided a lot of like my my goals in doing Rise Against. It's like I grew up on so many great bands, but also in a great scene that I cherish and that I don't know where I'd be without. And so like I want to sort of like make sure that like that this finds the next generation, and someone needs to kind of like be that link. So some other kid who feels lost and doesn't identify with mainstream culture can find like that home and that tribe.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, where do you sort of feel like Nowhere Generation kind of sits for you? I guess like in like the Rise Against canon, because obviously, because I was listening to it, and to me it felt, in a lot of ways reminiscent of sort of the earlier stuff. Like it was maybe, I guess, like a little heavier than I expected, which I thought was cool. I mean, where do you feel like it sits, or is it hard for you to sort of have that perspective on your own band?
It's so hard for me to have that perspective.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. But it's interesting because I never thought of it as heavy or classic Rise, but like you're like the 10th person that's told me that it does sound like that. So I realized like, oh, like it's just indicative of it. I'm like that, like I'm the wrong person to to write the bio for like what we're doing nowadays, like I don't, we're too in the middle of it. I never know, you know what I mean? Like Joe and Joe will tell you this too. Like when we put out Appeal to Reason and we had too many songs, Joe and I both put Savior on the list of songs to remove from the record, and that became like our biggest single. And like, so like, you can't trust me with big decisions like that is what I'm trying to say. You know what I mean? Or to be that aware of like, of how we fit into like people's listening experience.
What I mean, I feel like from a guitar playing perspective, like to me, like there's a lot of cool guitar interplay on the record, like especially on a song like Sudden Urge. I mean, did you approach sort of your playing in any kind of new ways? Do you feel like you were able to kind of stretch out or try anything new with this record?
There's a lot of freedom to like going into your 9th album.
Yeah.
These are no longer our formative years. I don't think we ever felt a lot of pressure, like external pressure. I think internal pressure is all we ever felt. But I think this one was just I just remember feeling like that freedom to just do whatever, try stuff, and so you just kind of go for it, and have a lot of fun with it. And I do most of my guitars, or all my guitars, with Jason Livermore, and he's like a hard guy to please. He's a bit of a bully, and we've also known each other for 20 years, so he's happy to give me shit, tell me to do it again, tell me my idea sucks, but I also know like when I get him, when he likes something, like I know I've done something right, so
Right.
that relationship is important.
What is your sort of, I mean, obviously the mission statement with this record, you're going to be touring on it soon. I mean, what's your kind of hopes as far as like the type of reaction you're going to get from this record from fans? I mean, do you want, because obviously it's about this other generation, but do you feel like it sort of is relatable sort of to anyone, even someone say our age or even older?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I've like sort of kind of figured out as I explored this topic. I started thinking about like younger people, what they're going through, but like really anybody who feels like they're trying to get ahead and they can't, they're trying to run the race
Right.
from the finish line, he's moving on them. And I realize that's people our age, it's people older than us, anybody who feels kind of like invisible. You don't need to have been born between this year and this year to like to fit into it. And I really thought that this was stuff that was just bubbling just underneath the surface of people's anxieties and fears. Like it was easy to, we're an American political punk rock band living during the last 4 years of America. There was a lot of low hanging fruit to sing about, a lot of easy targets. But I didn't want to sing about the symptoms. I wanted to sing about the disease. And this was the thing that I found was weighing on people more than whoever was going to be our next president or whatever. They were kind of figuring out like, yo, what does the future look like if like everything is trending in a direction of benefiting the few and hurting the many. And I think that to answer your question, like what I hope people get out of this, like I know when we've like hit a nerve with a song, when people kind of like finish my sentences, you know what I mean? Or like interrupt me and take it away and say, dude, I know what you're talking about. And like, it reminds me of this, or I feel like this. And that's when I know like a song is like, really like striking somebody significantly, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes, I'm almost done, but like sort of when it comes to like punk, like having been like a lifelong kind of punk hardcore person in the community and in bands, I mean, do you think of it as like a sound or as an ideology or as both, or what kind of comes to mind when you sort of think of what punk means, I guess, in like 2021, say?
I guess I think of it as like an ideology and like a feeling, you know, because you can listen to something that may not have all the ingredients of like the punk that you grew up on, but it can still feel punk, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that every time I've ever like sat down to write a song or do anything like that, I realized one day that I'm not trying to create like a Peg Boy song. I'm not trying to create a Minor Threat song. I'm trying to create like the feeling of it, you know? It's like it's a lot of what people will say, like why we exaggerate when we tell stories. The reason we have this like proclivity to exaggerate is because we want the listener to feel what we felt, you know? And that's kind of what I think about like punk rock is I'm just trying to communicate that feeling in the way that I know how. And so I'm always trying to like emulate those ingredients of punk, but it's not going to sound like Bad Brains. It's just going to sound like what I think it should feel like, you know?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think that's totally true. And I think that people can really sense, like pick up on that feeling as well in the music.
That's my hope, right? Is that like, you know, like that people connect with it in that way. And not everyone's going to connect with it, but it's not also not meant for everybody, you know? And
Right.
so it's meant for the people who can like really identify with it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that should be good for me. That should be
Oh, okay, cool, man.
that should be great.
Awesome.